So we have a guest today. Iyad Rahwan runs Scalable Cooperation here at the Media Lab. You've seen some of his slides in my presentation already, but we'll let him present on autonomous vehicles, the moral machine, and some work that he's doing on labor. And then we'll roll into a conversation and a case and have a conversation with Iyad about his work. So take it away, Iyad.
Okay, so I'm going to have to use this thing. Is it working? Is it working? Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to present together with Eddie, who's a postdoc in the group, and we'll talk about the moral machine experiment, but also a bunch of other studies that we've been doing around that. And maybe some of them will be familiar to you. I hope we'll show you some new results, so that will hopefully be interesting as well. I wanted to start with this picture because you've probably all seen this already in the class. I'm a very big fan of this, this model of regulations, things that regulate. And actually, I drew Larry Lessig himself in the middle here, just to emphasize that. And I'm really interested in how when we have new kinds of agents like machines, like autonomous cars, for example, I think it's helpful to think also in terms of these four regulatory forces. And I think it's useful because if we do, then we recognize that not only is the architecture of the system itself, what is the car capable of doing and what sort of sensors does it have, matters, but also the law, right? Liability, who's at fault when the car causes damage and so on, which is kind of the obvious thing, but also markets and norms, right? So markets would influence, market forces, the incentives of people who would buy these cars matter, in this case as well, and they shape what sort of cars get built. And also norms, what sort of expectations do people have? Do these norms differ between different countries, for example? And so on. And how does, I would put also in norms human psychology as well, right? So how do the cognitive biases of people shape the way that they perceive these types of machines and the expectations of their behavior? So, so keeping that in mind, let's move to discuss some of the results that we've got. If you're interested in kind of a broader overview of this, we've written a piece which is more like an op-ed that got published last year on the psychological roadblocks to the adoption of self-driving vehicles. And we classify these into three major ones. Oops. We have, as you can see, these are very important roadblocks. I hope this... So one of them is ethical dilemmas, and which is kind of fear of the unknown, right? And then there's sort of psychological bias about the ability to trust something that is not you. And finally, this opacity, which is something that you cannot really perceive or understand. You don't have a mental model of it. Let's hope this problem is isolated. So I wanted to ask first, I wanted to also say something about the way that we regulate machines. They're sort of, in a way, they're a bit like regulating products. So the way that you regulate an AI, a machine like an autonomous car or a robot that is adaptive, maybe it's similar to the way we regulate chairs or children's toys. You cannot use certain material in children's toys because they would be toxic. And there's standards for which age groups can you allow certain toys to be sold to because they have pieces that are too small and so on, which are choking hazards. Certain kinds of warnings you have to put on the products for consumers to use. So it's kind of similar to that. But regulating AI systems is also kind of in a way like regulating humans. And I would love to hear the legal opinion here as well, because they exhibit things that chairs or toys, passive children toys don't exhibit, right? Things like autonomy. they make decisions on their own. Things like intentionality, like the action, the thing takes an action for a certain purpose. Things like adaptation, so the ability to learn behavioral patterns that were not programmed before. This is not something that a table or a child's Lego would do, right? Unless you program it with Scratch or something. Okay, so now let's move to the case of autonomous cars with this kind of background. And let's think about the promised benefits that the proponents of this technology are promoting. And they're saying that they could, in principle, eliminate 90%. Some people say 94% of today's accidents. And the reason is most of today's accidents are caused by people, by human misjudgment, right? So the human mistake or human error. So people cannot react in time. They don't assess the situation sufficiently well because they don't see objects in their periphery and so on. So it seems like a no-brainer that we have to adopt this technology. And there are obvious technical hurdles that we have to overcome before we make that happen. And there are also legal hurdles that smart people who teach tort law think about. Who's at fault when something wrong happens? Is it manslaughter or not if you kill somebody and so on? But I think there are also kind of psychological issues that we have to take into account, and this falls under this norms, right? Public acceptance category. And let's start with one of them. And this one it's actually new research that we've done. This has nothing to do with ethics. It has to do with trust. So when should we deploy autonomous cars? Should we deploy them when they are as safe as humans, 10% safer than humans, 50%, 90%? There was a study that was published last year conducted by the Rand Corporation, in which they said, well, perfection is the enemy of good. How many lives would we lose if we wait, right? Because there's two ways in which you can lose lives. One is the technology isn't safe, it's less safe than humans, and the other one is you're waiting for it to be perfected, and people are dying in the meantime, right? So they did a whole bunch of basically simulations of some sort of different trajectories of the improvement of the technology, different trajectories of consumer adoption, like how fast people buy these things, and they found that over a 30-year period, 30-year horizon, more lives would be cumulatively saved under the improved 10 policy, meaning that we would allow mass adoption as soon as the cars are 10% safer than the average human, than improve 75 or improve 90, which is waiting until they've eliminated 75% of accidents or 90% of accidents that we have. And in some cases, this is more than 500,000 lives. I mean, imagine, that's a lot of people, right? If you have, that's a serious public health decision that regulators have to take. Okay. So we looked at this and we thought, okay, that's great, but will people actually buy these things? Even if you do allow mass production at this threshold, only 10% safer than the average human. So I'm going to ask you first, let's do a quiz. It's going to motivate the study. What number would you choose here? I'm a safer driver than X% of all drivers in the US. What's X for you? Who's safer than 10% of drivers in the US? Let's say, if you drive. How many people drive, actually? Okay. Okay, who considers themselves safer than 50% of drivers? Who considers themselves safer than 70% of the drivers? 90? Okay. All right, you're a reasonable bunch. But basically, there's something called the better than average effect, or the illusory superiority, which is a psychological effect that in which people always consider themselves better than average. So if you take the average of people's estimations of their performance, that the median shoots up significantly. So we'll show you some of those results. So you can also ask things like, I would ride. So after we ask them this question, we ask these questions. I would ride with a self-driving car that was at minimum a safer driver than X% of drivers in the US. So clearly, if you consider yourself above average driver, you would expect the car to be above average before you would be willing to ride in it, because otherwise you would be safer than the car. So the bias that shapes your perception of your own capabilities is going to also shape your adoption, your willingness to adopt the technology. So we also asked, we framed the questions in a couple of different ways, and I just want to show you the results. So this is the percentage of accidents eliminated. So we varied those, you can see this is a spectrum from 0, this is the current status quo. This is what we have now. And then this is eliminating 10% of today's accidents, 50%, 75%, and 90%, and so on. And this is how many people would be willing to purchase a car or to get in a car, to ride in a car that has eliminated this percentage of accidents. And rationally, you would think if we all believe that we are average drivers, we would all adopt the cars at this point, right? But we don't. Only 8% of people do. Because most people believe they're much better drivers. And 50%, so this is half of the risk is eliminated, and only 22% of people are willing to adopt them. In fact, 35% of people want more than 90% safety, right? Improvement on safety. So that's kind of a problem, right? Now, we then asked, well, maybe this is a question of, maybe this doesn't have to do with machines. Maybe people are just not willing to get in a car driven by another human being. So there's nothing special about the cars being self-driving. It's just I don't trust other people, to drive myself or other entities because I just believe in my own skills. But then we did this, and the results look like this. So you can see that when it's another human driver, you still see this effect, that people have higher expectations. If they knew how good the Uber drivers were, if Uber were to publish these statistics, people would require safer Uber drivers than average because they think they're safer. But you can see that there's a gap, right? So with automated vehicles, this threshold is actually pushed further, right? So the requirement is much higher. So for an Uber driver or an autonomous car that is 90% safer than the average driver, there's a big difference between 91% people willing to get in a car with somebody else who's that safe, but only 66%. This is in a replication of the study. So I think that's interesting, right? It shows us that this is a real cognitive bias, has nothing to do with ethics, that is going to delay the adoption of autonomous cars. And how to handle this and how to overcome this bias is a question we're now asking. And so this is the potential buyers of autonomous vehicles depending on the safety level. So you could see, so this is trying to connect the people's self-appraisal of their own driving skills to this decision. So this is for people, like, for example, people who think, who demand a car that is 50% safer than the average driver. Their median self-assessment is 75%, right? Like, so they think they're safer than 75% of other drivers. For example, actually, no, sorry, this is the median of the entire sample. But you can see as the safety threshold, the safety requirement increases for these people, you can see that the color distribution is the distribution of their own self-assessment, right? So here you can see the median is actually quite high. It's actually much higher than 75%. So there's a correlation between how good I think I am as a driver and what I demand from others. So I just wanted to give you this this question or to highlight this issue for you as an example of this kind of psychological barrier to adopting a technology that you don't understand, even if the numbers give you very clear indication that it's safer, that it's better than humans. Now, a different psychological barrier is going to be the ethical dilemmas and the safety, whose safety the cars are going to prioritize. And in this case, this is a thing that I think Joey has already mentioned, so I'll go through it very briefly. But basically, we found that now in situations where the crash is unavoidable, the question is whose safety should the car prioritize? For example, should it prioritize the safety of the greater number of people, even if, and should it harm a bystander on the pavement, for example, to save more people? Or should it compromise the safety of the person in the car to save the greater number of people? And that's, I think, is an important question because it shows you the limits of not just the norms, but also the market in solving this problem. So the paper that we published a couple of years ago found or stated that people would never buy cars that would sacrifice them, but they want everybody else to do so. So they want all cars to minimize harm, but they don't want to buy this car themselves. And this has this kind of signature of the tragedy of the commons, which is the thing that, I want what's good for society, but I don't want to contribute the small price, the personal price to bring about that outcome. And if everybody thinks this way, then we won't bring out that outcome for sure. And we also asked people whether they'd be willing to accept regulation that ensures everybody opts into this, minimizing harm. And people would say, well, if you regulate it, I won't opt in. Right? So this is the difference between the traditional tragedy of the commons and the situation we have now, because people can say, well, I'll just stick with my own car. Thank you very much. I don't want to opt into a system in which a car is programmed to kill me under certain conditions. Right? So you can imagine that this actually exacerbates this issue that we found before. It's another psychological bias that will exacerbate the unwillingness or the hesitation of people to adopt the autonomous cars. I wanted to show something quickly, which is, well, this is a contrived scenario. It doesn't make any sense. Most accidents, most of driving doesn't include ethical dilemmas. This is astronomically rare. There's been a lot of criticism of this sort. I just wanted to address it quickly by saying that the dilemma is an idealization or an abstraction of something that's much more common. In fact, happens every single second or minute. And just show you an example here of, if you have a car that, a large truck that drives next to you, you probably instinctively move slightly away from the large truck already. And by doing so, you may end up getting closer to the bike lane, let's say. And that slightly increases risk for a cyclist, if the cyclist happens to be in that lane, which would lead to a different outcome in expectation than the opposite outcome of giving the cyclist the benefit here. So we're calling this the statistical trolley problem, because maybe in a single instant, nothing will happen, if you stay away from the cyclist. But over 1 million instances of this situation, over many, many cars that are programmed to behave in this way, perhaps you would have a passenger fatality because you're increasing the risk of collision with this big car. But if the car is programmed to get further away from the large truck, then again, over 1 million instances of the situation, you may end up with a single cyclist fatality. So again, we have 1 versus 5. So from a kind of policy perspective, it's a similar kind of trade-off. It's a trade-off between actual lives lost that is an immediate consequence of the way that a car is programmed, right? So you can imagine here that if the cars are programmed to maximize passenger safety, then clearly you're going to get the second outcome, right? Because these are the customers who are paying for the car. So just to show you that this is not science fiction or not sort of a purely intellectual exercise. And it's also something that patents are, this Google patent describes, where this is a situation in which this vehicle is supposed to decide whether to overtake a truck that is stuck at the lights. And the utilitarian calculus, or the utilitarian self-preserving calculus, is very clear here. So this is an actual table from the patent filing where a risk penalty is computed based on the probability of different events and the risk magnitude of the different events. So you can think of the risk magnitude as the the expected liability from an accident of a particular type. So you could see, hitting a pedestrian who runs is, that's $100,000 in liability, and that's a very low probability event, but then this is the risk penalty, right? So you can see that these things are actually car companies or companies that are developing this technology actually thinking about this sort of calculus in very explicit terms. So then of course, people like Jonathan Zittrain would say, well, maybe you should increase this number a little bit, reduce this number, and so on. And that's your policy lever, right? And it's something that people have, in regulations have been thinking about, but they have been pointing to this kind of lack of consensus as well, public consensus, and also that there are no metrics to evaluate against. So with that, I want to pass on the mic now to Eddie, who's going to talk about the Model Machine project and some of the very recent results that we've got.
Thank you. All right, so to promote this public discussion, we built the Model Machine, and Joey talked about it before. I'll just review briefly what it is. It's like a website that generates random moral dilemmas that are faced by a driverless car, and it asks you what you think the car should do in those dilemmas. For example, here we have a driverless car that is heading on the street. 4 pedestrians jump in front of the car, 1 male, 1 female, and 1 large female, and a dog. They are all crossing on a do not cross signal, which is they are all jaywalking. And we assume here that the brake failed, so the car will either kill those 4 pedestrians, or it could swerve into a barrier, killing the only passenger that it has, which is a female athlete. And then it asks you what you think the car should do. And then each user that goes to the website would see like 13 scenarios of this type, and then at the end of the 13 scenarios, it shows you a summary of your results. Here's an example of one of the users, who summary. This is not the aggregated results, so this is just one example of. It also shows you like, for example, when it comes to saving more lives, where do you fit in the spectrum, like compared to other people, protecting passengers, upholding the law. Of course, these summaries are just for fun because each person only takes 13 scenarios, so these are not enough to form any kind of accurate judgment of one person. But when we get all of these numbers for so many people, we can start making some statistical inferences. So let's try this together. Let's try to do some moral machine exercise now. So here we have a scenario where we have a driverless car that is empty, which is fine. It's a driverless car. And then there is a boy in front of this car. If the car continues, it's going to kill this boy. The car could instead avoid that by swerving into the other side and kill 1 man. So raise your hand if you think in this scenario the car should swerve, sacrifice the man in order to spare the boy. How many people would? All right. I'd assume that the people who didn't raise their hands would kill the boy, but whatever. So this is what the users of Moral Machine, converge to. 73% would have swerved and sacrificed the man in order to spare the boy. All right, so let's try another scenario. Seems like you're a little bit shy. Let's try this one. Again, a self-driving car. It's empty. 1 man is in front of the car. The car, if the car does nothing, is going to kill this man who is crossing legally. On the other side, the car could avoid killing this man by swerving to the other side and kill a male athlete who is crossing illegally, like jaywalking. So if we leave it continue, it's going to kill this man who's crossing legally, or if it could swerve to kill the illegal crossing athlete. So raise your hand if you think the car should swerve and kill the, sacrifice the athletes. Oh, there you go. So again, this is what the users converge to. 72% would swerve, sacrifice the illegally crossing male athlete and spare the legally crossing male. All right, last one. Now the car could continue straight and kill one legally crossing male, or it could swerve and kill two illegally crossing males. Raise your hand if you think the car should swerve in this scenario, sacrifice more illegally crossing. All right, less people. This is what our users thought. They are more in like 56% would stay straight and 44% would swerve. Okay, let's talk a little bit about how we designed this website. Or first of all, these are like the family tree, like a family picture of our characters. We have like the males and females, elderly, executive, doctors, athletes, pregnant woman, a homeless person, criminal, dogs and cats. And in each scenario, basically, we have four main elements that we play with. First element is whether the car should continue straight or it should swerve. That's the difference between omission and commission. The second part is whether the casualties are pedestrians or passengers. Sometimes you might put pedestrians versus pedestrians. The third element is if they are pedestrians, whether they are crossing legally or illegally. And then the fourth element is the type of those characters. In this case, we have elderly characters on one side and young characters on the other side. More systematically, we have the element of interventionism, whether stay or swerve, the relation to AV, which is like passenger versus pedestrians or pedestrians versus pedestrians, the legality, whether one part is legally crossing, the other is illegally crossing, or sometimes we don't have legality involved. And then the character types, in which we have 6 different attributes. One of them is male versus female, the gender, the age, young versus elderly, the fitness, the social status, low versus high, humans versus pets, and more characters versus less characters. So we have in total 9 attributes. Of course, we also translated the website to 9 other languages, so we have in total 10 languages to increase the visibility. We had more than 4 million users so far visit the website. They all contributed to more than 40 million dilemmas, like the ones that you just saw. And there is a survey at the end that people could add more information. Also, we had like more than 500,000 who answered this survey. Users came from different places, from all around the world. This is just to show like at least one user came from all of these places. You might see that there are some empty places. But if we put this next to the map of the lit world, we find that these are the places which have like electricity or have like a light. So this is kind of, there's a pretty much like very close representation. And so this is the kind of main results that we find. So just to explain how we can see those results, first we can see that on the right side we have sparing humans, and on the left side we have sparing pets. This is here we say like, this is how much people prefer sparing humans over sparing pets. And this is the probability that they will spare humans. So we're gonna if we take all the scenarios that have humans on one side, and we see how many times people saved those humans, and we take all the scenarios where when we had pets on one side and probability of people sparing those pets, and then we just subtract these 2 values. So we get like a difference of 0.6, so this is the biggest difference. Next, we could also try this with having all the scenarios where you had more characters on one side than the other side, and we see how many times people spared the more characters versus how many times they spared the less characters. We subtract. We could also, because we varied the difference in number of characters, so we have difference of 1, 2, 3, and 4. So if we had like 5 versus 1, that's a difference of 4 characters, which is even the difference is bigger than sparing humans over pets. We could do this with all the 9 different attributes. And we could also compare those 9 attributes. So as we said, the species seems to be like the most, like the factor that people seem to agree the most on, that it kind of make a difference. Then the number of characters, and then after that, the age. So it seems like so many people approve of sparing young characters over elderly. So here, if you look at this graph, always the ones on the right are the ones that are preferred over the ones on the left. Now, sparing the young over the elderly is kind of interesting, and you might think this might be driven by some part of those young characters, like maybe the babies are like, people prefer them, but then when it's a different kind of characters, people change their mind. So what we did is actually we went and tried every kind of character. So we take now, so this is again, we take all the scenarios that have one character, let's say in this case the baby stroller, and we see how many times people spare that character, and we compare that with the adult male or adult female cases. So, and then we subtract them again. So here we see that the baby stroller is much more safe than the adult man and woman. We can do this for all the characters and order them. So we see here like the top most saved 4 characters are the baby stroller, the girl, the boy, and then the pregnant woman. So we can see all of these characters have some kind of elements of young character in them. Also, if we look at the bottom of the list, aside from the dog and the cat and the criminal, on top of that we see directly elderly man and elderly woman. So it seems like the attribute of age is something that is kind of something that most people are kind of seem to find it like okay or like an obvious thing that we should that should be used in or like that's what they think that should be used. So let's see how this let's contrast this with one of the guidelines that that have been out. So Germany is probably one of the first countries that started putting some general guidelines for ethics of autonomous vehicles. They formed a committee of experts, professors in law, ethics, engineering, Catholic bishop. And this committee, put some kind of guidelines. Let's see how our, what the public, let's see how the overlap between the public and those experts. So the first point we found that the most approved thing is that people want to spare humans over pets. And this kind of in agreement with what those experts found. They said that the system should be programmed in a way to accept the damage to animals if that means sparing humans. Next, the next in line was saving more people over fewer. And this also somehow, is not in disagreement with what the committee put, which is that, any programming to reduce the number of personal injuries might be justified. The third in the order is sparing young over elderly, and this comes in disagreement with what the committee said, which is that any distinction based on personal features is strictly prohibited. Next in line is people were more in favor of sparing higher status over lower status, also come in disagreement with the guidelines. The fifth in line was sparing lawful over the unlawful, and this is not in disagreement with one of the, which we could understand with one of the guidelines which say that parties involved in the generation of the risk should not sacrifice the non-involved parties. So we could understand this as in like if the dilemma came out of some jaywalkers, then the non-jaywalkers should not be sacrificed in that scenario. Next, we try to see if there are any like a characteristic or like some if you can have like a different populations have different preferences. So we split our users depending on their age into 2 groups: the younger users and older users. We calculate the same 9 numbers that I showed you before for each subpopulation, and then we subtract those numbers. So what I showed you before was delta P, because it's a probability of saving this minus this. Now this is a delta P. So this is basically probability of sparing something minus, given that the respondent is older, minus probability of sparing humans, given that the respondent is younger. So for example, we can see here that older people are more in favor of sparing humans over pets than the younger users. We can see also that younger users are more in favor of sparing the young. Which kind of makes sense. We can see also that younger users are more in favor of sparing the fit and the higher status, which is all things that could probably also kind of related to younger users as well. It's kind of in their self-interest. We could also do the same split on other attributes like education, whether like our more educated users versus less educated users, male users or versus female users, like female users are more in favor of sparing females. Same thing with income, political views, religious views. We can see in more cases that there are not much differences. Next, we could do this also at the level of each country. So we could calculate the 9 numbers for each country, and then construct like a distance between every 2 countries and use that to do like clusters. And we find like we have like 3 big clusters of countries. One cluster, we call it Western because it has many Western countries. The other one call it Eastern because it has so many Eastern countries. And then the third one, we call it Southern because it has Latin American and some of the previous French colony countries. And then we could also calculate those 9 numbers for each clusters. We can see that, for example, here, Eastern countries are more in favor of sparing the lawful. For example, Southern countries are more in favor of sparing females if you compare them with the other 2 clusters. Then we could also try to see how these findings correlate with other cultural measures. One of the measures is the individualism versus collectivism. Like some societies are individualist in the sense that they care about they trust institutions and they care about the person reputation. Other societies are more collectivist, where they care more about the connection and social connections. We see that more individualist society, the more it tries to save more characters, because individual society believe that everyone should be equal, so more people is always better than less people. Also, another measure is the rule of law, how strong the law is in a society or in country, also could predict people sparing the lawful more. I'm going to skip this. And then we could also make a distance from the US, like how different each country is from the US. So it might be like if US also put guidelines at some point, then some countries might make more sense for some countries to copy those guidelines. Those are the ones that are the closest to the US, but might not make sense for other countries which are far from US to do that. And then we show that this measure actually corresponds to or correlates with other measures that were done by other people in genetic distance from US and cultural distance from the US. And I will give to Iyad.
Thank you. Okay, so here we are. Okay, so now, here basically the bigger picture here is that we have a new technology, autonomous cars, machines that have, that are capable of, what Joey calls kinetic autonomy, which I think is a really cool term, and because they're capable of physical harm, unlike some of the other things you may have studied, which are systems that are capable of different kinds of harm, like psychological or economic harm. But now I do think that the autonomous vehicles also can lead to non-physical harm, things like economic harm. For example, by replacing 3 million truck drivers in the US, and I don't know how many taxi drivers and Uber drivers and people who rely on being in the transportation sector in order to make their living. So I just wanted to give you a very quick overview of some of the work we're doing, which I think is trying to really take this discussion from thinking about very coarse categories of jobs, like, drivers will be automated, or professors will be automated, or won't be automated, and so on, to really thinking about the skills that constitute those jobs. Because automation is going to automate certain skills which perform specific tasks. It doesn't take a job or a person and automate them wholesale. And we've seen this before, because people in some cases, are able to adapt. Sometimes a factory worker is completely automated over time. In other cases, a bank teller is partially automated. The cash handling tasks are automated, and then these bank tellers start doing other things. So they kind of adjust the composition of their work by shifting to other skills. So what we wanted to do is map those skills and map the structure of these skills so that we can understand the adaptation in the system. And it's something that it seems that mainstream economics has not really gotten to the point where they can analyze these sorts of dynamics yet. So we resorted to other techniques. But the whole motivation is, how can we quantify this idea of racing with the machine rather than racing against the machine? Racing with the machine presumably means working on developing skills that are complementary to the machine, rather than trying to be very, even better than the machines at the things that they're encroaching on. So the first thing we did was we looked at differential impact. Well, we said, we took some numbers that people have come up with on the impact of automation on jobs, and we just looked at it spatially and found that, the impact from automation is not going to be uniform. There are places which are in blue, which are expected by AI scientists to experience a lower impact than some of those places in warmer colors. And then we found this very interesting trend, which is that city size matters. So it's something that is a function of the size of the local labor market, which is how economists refer to the labor market of a city. And we found basically that smaller cities are, comparatively speaking, going to experience greater impact, which is kind of worrying because there's already significant urbanization. People are moving to cities to find jobs. And this trend is only likely to accelerate, it seems, in the presence of automation. So the second thing that we started doing is we started to use biological metaphors to try and think of the labor market as an ecology in which there are basically mutualistic relationships between different workers and that operate at kind of population level and have potentially nonlinear dynamics. So let me explain what this means in the case of this bipartite network that shows you relationships between different species of bees and different species of flower. So what ecologists do is they map these networks by investigating, from data which bees pollinate which flowers. And what happens is, these flowers optimize their nectar to attract certain kinds of bees. But there are these kind of interesting relationships because if two flowers rely on the same species of bee, and that bee goes extinct, maybe because that bee cannot, live in certain conditions or certain temperatures, then these sort of problems can start cascading because the species of bee cannot pollinate the flowers die, then this other species of bee which relies on it for nectar also dies, and that kind of creates a cascade. And not every change creates a cascade. So the way that mathematical ecologists study this is they project these networks. So they create a network of dependencies between the flowers, right? That maps, that is, if this flower goes extinct or dies in an island, then these other flowers might actually also be affected indirectly through the bees, right, that pollinate them. And the same thing goes for the bees as well. Now, we took this model and started doing these kind of similar projections to try and map the dependencies between the skills. So obviously, an occupation is a bundle of skills, right? Because a job is basically a set of tasks that need to be completed, and workers provide skills that complete these tasks. And you could use this to project a network of skills that show those dependencies, right? So if a skill gets automated now, we could think of similar kinds of cascades that may occur. Now, when we map this network, first of all, we use the technique that was used by Cesar Hidalgo, who's in this building, the next building. And Cesar did this kind of exercise, this network mapping exercise for products that countries export. And the interesting thing he found was that this network has a core and periphery structure. So you have a periphery of very simple products like, very raw materials like fish oil or fish or vegetables or fruit. And then in the middle, you have these complex products that have a lot of dependencies with other products. So countries start at the periphery and then try to move to the middle as they get more developed. Now, we expected to see the same thing for skills. You have a core of kind of important key skills, and then you have a periphery of maybe specialized sort of obscure skills. But what we found is that we have two separate cores, okay? So let's go back. which was kind of striking for us because, why would you observe this? But then it made sense that there's a core of skills that are sensory physical and a core of skills that are social and cognitive, and they seem to kind of operate separately. And there's this narrow bridge between them of skills which are, fundamental to all jobs. So these things are things like memorizing numbers, doing basic numeracy, switching tasks. For example, everybody needs to do some kind of task switching. And then what we do is when we projected this network also on the jobs instead of on the skills, we observe the same kind of polarization, right? And actually, this is something that we're still doing now. A student in the group, Judy, is doing. We're observing that this structure is getting more polarized over time as well, which I think is even more scary, right? Because then it means that if you live in one part of this space, then it gets harder and harder to switch because there are no adjacent skills. You have to learn everything wholesale. And it matters because if you are a person with skills which are predominantly on the right sensory physical cluster, you don't make a lot of money, right? This is the median household, the median income for these jobs. And then the more you move to the left, the more money you make. You can see a chief executive is very much so on the left side. And there's a kind of a not very smooth transition between those two things, right? There's not many people with a little bit of skills on this side and on the right side and on the left side. And I think what's more scary is that not only individual workers exhibit this behavior or this kind of pattern, but also cities. And here I have 3 characteristic cities. One of them is Yuma, Arizona, which I think is a kind of farming city, and it's a small city as well, in line with the previous result. The workers in the city, so if you take all the employment statistics and you break down the workers into their skills, and you add up all of those skills together and project them here to see what is this city skilled at. You see that it's skilled mostly in things that are on the right side, in the sensory physical cluster. Which, by the way, is also much more susceptible to automation because it includes things that are physical, finger dexterity, manipulation, and so on. And you can see Detroit here is sort of straddling, between those two worlds. And by the way, these are median household incomes. And then finally, we have New York, which is, people would say is a very resilient city, and very much lives on the left side. So I think as we think about retraining truck drivers, which would be to a large extent on the right side because their job requires a lot of sensory skills, multi-limb coordination, spatial orientation, and things like this. It's clearly being automated, like we know that because of Elon Musk and others. Then we have an issue, right? And the other issue we have is that it's not obvious how you can reconfigure this network by retraining people. And we hope to inform those kinds of strategies going forward. And we're really interested in kind of the short term, what sort of retraining programs can work, but also in the kind of extreme scenarios that people are talking about, which is mass unemployment. And I would say that mass unemployment is kind of equivalent to an ecosystem collapse, right? So the system just cannot sustain itself anymore. And these are not our results. These are results from different kinds of perturbations to ecosystem networks that are done. So for example, this is a study by Laszlo Barabasi across the river. And what you do is you basically start deleting nodes, for example. So you basically extinct certain species of flowers at random, and you see what happens. You play out the dynamics of the network, and you see how the network reconfigures itself, and at what point does the network collapse? Okay, so basically the abundance of the species goes to 0 because the system just cannot sustain itself. And there are different points at which this happens. This is particular parameterization. And then you could also do things like link loss. So you remove the link between the nodes rather than delete the nodes themselves. You also do kind of weight loss. So you change the abundance of certain things. So all of a sudden you reduce the number of flowers, or let's say you inject a certain skill, right, if these are skills, you inject a certain skill into the system by retraining a lot of people in it. So what we're doing now is we're applying similar methods to the network of skills, and the early results show that we're actually able to predict things like recovery, like things from history, things like recovery from the last financial crisis, better than some of the other models. So there's information in this network that we're able to extract. And then once we're able to show that you could predict the past, we want to predict the future and be speculative, but in a more intelligent way about what might happen in these types of systems. So we wanted to end up with kind of a few questions for discussion, but of course, we'll leave it to the course instructors here to figure out. But I just wanted to kind of throw these questions in relation to jobs. Some of the questions that I think are interesting is it realistic to assume employment could collapse? Or is this just an insane question? Should we slow down technological progress? It provides lots of benefits, and how do we resolve these kind of trade-offs between maybe we live in an unequal world if we move forward too fast, but maybe there's prosperity that we're giving up as well. And I like to think of trade-offs because everything is a trade-off in life, right? Everything, you can't have it all. I wish we could. And what new problems would, if we did think about universal basic income as something that, mass unemployment would, that would support a world with mass unemployment, where we as humans are redundant, then could this introduce new kinds of problems, social problems, and so on? Or would we find other things to occupy us and to keep us happy? And the other thing is also I found interesting is that I'm fascinated by is this question of whether, if government becomes so powerful and are able to police the world with drones and robots and so on, why do they need to opt into this social contract? Why would they need to? Are they compelled, or could they just force us, into a different kind of regime? And I think that's an interesting scenario to think about as well. And we have discussion of questions also related to autonomous cars more broadly, like in the ethics questions. When should we allow those autonomous cars on the road? Should we take psychological barriers into account in this kind of aversion to trust in vehicles? How do we overcome this aversion? Do we just educate people, or is there something better we can do? Should we force people to adopt autonomous cars and ban them from driving? Also, why should any of these of the following parties be involved in regulation? Like, what are the incentives and the kind of the moral hazards, that manufacturers have, for example? They want to sell cars. So what does that lead to? For example, it leads to prioritizing the driver over passengers, unless they were forced somehow to do something else. What about the policymakers? Do they have incentives as well? Can there be regulatory capture of some sort? And the public, you've seen that the opinion of the public conflicts with some of the German guidelines for autonomous vehicles. And in some cases, it conflicts in a good way, you could argue. Like, the public thinks you should prioritize kids, and the guidelines say don't use age. But maybe saving kids is not so bad, right? But saving people with higher status over homeless people, that seems, that's also a public opinion that conflicts with the German guidelines, but it seems to be a bad sort of disagreement, right? In which you probably should overrule the public. So what role does it have? And how do you combine these opinions as well? And just reflecting on the moral machine results, how can we resolve these disagreements between the public and policymakers? And to what degree would the differences between the different country clusters should be taken into account in formulating guidelines or audit sort of processes around these technologies? So with that, I think we'll leave it, and we'll be part of the discussion, at least for the first part.
So we're going to go back to slide 8. So we did a discussion around some of these issues in a previous one, but I think this one on labor is, maybe we can use this as part of the case. So, and you'll be the consultant coming to Detroit. We're, let's say, the community in Detroit, trying to ask some of these questions. And so we can ask you questions. We can have opinions about what we think. But I think there are probably a couple of pieces. One is, what are you telling us in Detroit? I mean, first of all, what would you tell us to do?
Well, I think as a consultant, it depends, right? If my goal is to just improve efficiency, like an overall productivity of the the city or of the factories there, then I would say, automate everyone whose skill is on the right.
Well, I guess one question I would ask you is, what is your prediction, and how confident are you about your prediction about what will happen to Detroit in 5 years if we keep the course?
We're not there yet, like in terms of our results, I would say. So I think it's super hard to make kind of these singular predictions about a particular city. I think the point we want to get to is being able to run kind of an ensemble of simulations of different scenarios, just like that study of the adoption of autonomous cars and how many people would die. And then you say on average, or this is a distribution of outcomes. And then it seems that under this regime, things are bad. And
so let me ask you, so how would we use your tool? Is it a dashboard as we keep moving into it? What would be how are you useful to us?
So at the moment, the tool is mostly visualization. And then the next step is we're going to include the simulation component into it. And for that, you basically want to understand the consequences of different assumptions a bit more explicitly. Like you say, well, I'm going to educate more people in these sorts of skills, and then you run the model, and then if the dynamics say that, well, the system will collapse anyway, then these assumptions, or these policies aren't helpful.
And we did a whole session on algorithmic bias and things like that. So we know that an algorithm is only as good as its underlying data, and the outcomes are only as good as how we tune the algorithm. So you're an algorithm using data, so there's kind of a meta thing, which is on the accuracy, which we can have input on and tune, right? So as a city council, we could say, wait, we don't like the way you're collecting the data, we don't like the assumptions you're making. So first of all, it would be kind of an open conversation about whether your models and your methods correct.
It's definitely wrong. So, okay, so let me, I think this is a very good point, actually, that you bring, because I think today the way we run the economy is based on wrong models. And there are people, smart people who argue that this is worse than running blind, because it gives you this perception that you have a model, and you've been thoughtful about this, and you have a theory, and there's somebody who won a Nobel Prize for it, and the model says, increase interest rates or decrease interest rates, and that's the best thing for the economy. And then something completely random happens, or completely different, or there's a collapse of, there's a recession that you can't anticipate. And somehow, people have been blaming, the economists for the advice that they've been given based on their models, but somehow the system doesn't change. Like the same people, you just bring different economists and they make the same kinds of mistakes. So I think this is why I think it's good to think in terms of ensemble, simulations of different scenarios, and then do something that minimizes average risk rather than be extremely confident. About
and yours is like, you mentioned to me once that it was like a weather model, more like predicting the weather. And you know that the weather isn't always correct, but you know that it's useful. And I remember in Davos, there was this funny session where I was on the climate team. It was years ago, right after the financial collapse. And the financial guys were next to us, and we said, you guys didn't see it coming, your models were wrong. And they said, you guys saw it coming but didn't do anything about it. And so I think that's the sort of two pieces, right? You've got models that are wrong, and then you have models that are roughly right, like some of our climate models, but we have no political or even a method to intervene. And I think those are the two things that we would have as a city. So even if we knew what was going on, can we actually do something? But I want to start to involve people. I know, like the first question, is it realistic to assume employment could collapse? There's a multi-layer thing here. I don't know if we have any people who have economics backgrounds, but the economists don't use these network models, right? They use different models. And they don't, but economies collapse, right? So do you want to frame the question? What's the argument for or against it?
Yeah, so there's this kind of idea that economists like to study systems in equilibrium. So, and some systems are always out of equilibrium. And this is like a big debate in economics, actually. But I would say mainstream economics studies equilibrium models because it assumes the system is always at equilibrium or will quickly get there. But there are people who say that it's never there, and you just need to have a good, have your dynamics in a good place, right?
And that's what Martin Novak at Harvard always talks about, is that the evolutionary dynamics people don't think in equilibriums. They think as evolution is a search pattern.
That's right.
Because you can't actually model economics properly if you think about equilibrium states, right?
I mean, there are economists who are introducing these ideas from complex systems, but they're kind of been marginalized, I would say.
Does anybody
They'll get back.
Anybody have an opinion on? Okay, hold on. Yeah, you want to run? Okay.
I have a question, but it's actually not related to this first point. So
Okay.
maybe should I ask it now?
You
or-
go ahead, yeah.
Okay. So it was actually about the moral machine presentation, and maybe it's a clarification question or an expression of skepticism, perhaps from a person that comes from the humanities. But I'm just wondering what the rationale or the question underlying your kind of survey and approach is, because to me it feels like asking people whether they prefer to swerve or to hit, which alternative they prefer between two, is an expression perhaps of a preference or of a feeling, but should that be the basis for thinking about what is right in terms of regulation? And so kind of aggregating those reactions might not be the best way to think about what the law might need to do. But I mean, it's a question that I'm kind of...
So I guess I'm curious, what would you put instead, for example? Like, what would be a problematic... If I understand the question correctly, like are you saying that the asking certain questions in itself is framing the discussion in a particular way?
I guess it's simply giving us an answer that might not be useful in terms of making policy. So, for example, I think in the next slide you had a question about how to reconcile what the public wants and what policymakers or judges or I don't know, people in government might want. And I guess it's the difference is that people are expressing preferences or ways to assess alternatives, and policymakers might and might not, because there might be all sorts of corruption or other kinds of considerations, but policymakers are thinking about what the public as a whole might need or might want. And I think that the kind of what is good for the public might not necessarily coincide with what a person filling a survey is thinking when kind of comparing two alternatives. So,
yeah, but I guess this is a question that should go to the lawyers, because, how do they, and it's a question I've asked JC actually before, like how do you, clearly the law is not a vote on every single issue. What is it? But on the other hand, we're always told that the legislators are the representatives of the public, and you gave me a very good explanation of this, and maybe, do you want to give it here?
I mean, the interesting tension that Elettra is raising is that of individual decisions and when is a collective decision the sum of individual decisions or something else, and what role might an individual be asked to adopt if the individual is responsible, as a mayor might be or a member of Congress, for the society at large. And it's interesting to see that come up in the moral machines context, as Elettra raised it, because actually, to me, it ties back to part A,
right,
back to the labor question. So I'm going to use some privilege and just bounce it back to that for a moment without delving another click into the moral machines piece, which is when I think about the contribution of your very pretty, and that sounds somehow derogatory, I mean literally very pretty visualizations, and I can imagine all the work that went into coding all this stuff, where does it fit in that map and how do we generate it? I think the takeaway, especially with your analogy to the bees and the flowers, is that it's important to look out for the whole ecosystem, not just for a given member of society who was displaced because of the impact of an automated replacement. And that's such an interesting rejoinder, say, to Jason Furman's paper. Like, my guess is Jason Furman isn't thinking about that at all. He's just thinking about atomized people who might be replaced, and all right, they need some job retraining, and don't give them basic income because 3 microeconomic reasons. And it's just such an interesting contribution that way, because if I'm thinking through the policy implications of this group is different from the sum of individuals, it might say that the town out west requires a form of policy intervention that New York doesn't, even though there will be people in identical jobs in both towns who are each losing them, but one might lead to a systemic collapse and the other wouldn't. So I think it's a very interesting policy contribution there to be insisting on thinking of it as an ecosystem. And there's a certain irony that autonomous vehicles make it that much easier to live in places that are far from your job. Yeah. So maybe that's another factor that scrambles the boundaries of the hive and how much physical proximity is the right unit to talk about for a colony here or there.
I think though it's important to remember that models are great until they're not. And so because we can model the economic collapse, I mean, so there's a couple of things that aren't in your model. We don't have augmentation, creating new types of skills. We don't have second order effects. So in UBI, I was just doing research, writing my article on it, but it's really interesting because we don't know whether UBI actually encourages people. There's not a lot of evidence about what it does. Does it actually get people to go back and retrain? Does it make people look for better jobs if they have crappy jobs? I mean, we don't really understand the second order effects. And so what's interesting is when you have enough of the stuff, so I think the idea of thinking about it as an ecosystem is really interesting and innovative. But then the question is, do we have the right drivers and do we have the second order effects enough so that we're actually modeling something accurately, right?
Yeah, so I think okay, so this conversation keeps getting more meta, but I like it. So I think the thing is, I think as an academic, you've noticed maybe...
There's a moment in every class where someone has said that.
Yeah.
At least the first part.
I like it. So I think you've sensed my hesitation to make kind of specific predictions about specific cities, and it's because I do think that the main lesson here is, this model is wrong because, well, first of all, it has 200 skills roughly, and it's based on specific data collected using specific methodology by the Department of Labor. And it doesn't include all the skills. For example, software installation and plumbing installation is like one skill, right? It doesn't distinguish between those two. So it's a very coarse distinction between skills. There are efforts using natural language processing to create a more fine-grained model, which will also be biased in some other way. And I think basically the qualitative lessons from these things are much more important than the specific. It's the idea that things are interconnected. Don't just do localized policies and forget the second and third order effects. And until we have the science that can model all of these secondary effects, let's just stick with that broad lesson rather than take this specific model at face value. And I think that and I think economists are very reasonable at this too, until they become chairman of the Federal Reserve, right? Yeah. Or until they become a full-time contributor to the New York Times, where they start being less sort of surrounded by people who are poking the holes in.
Well, that's the problem with academia, is whenever I say economists keeps using GDP, the economists say, well, we don't use GDP anymore because we've gone beyond that. We know the limitations, but whenever you see them on a panel, they keep using GDP. So I think the problem is they say, well, I have all of these qualifications to the thing, but then once you present it, people tend to, in the popular media, latch onto it. So I think that's the risk.
And when you have to fit it in an op-ed in the New York Times, right?
Yeah. Don't keep picking on the New York Times. Wall Street Journal. Wall Street Journal. Right, so we should get some of the other voices in, I think.
Yeah, there's a connection here, which...
a bias.
A bias.
Thanks for your talk. My question, I guess, just off of the conversation you guys are having, I study the history of science and technology. There are countless examples of politics being channeled through technology. I think that's what separates this from voting, is when you vote, you're actively participating politically in the world, and technology can mask political agency in action. And so I guess I just want to point to a couple of things. To avoid making those same mistakes with AVs, I think it's important as these norms are set to try and surface as many kind of political tendencies as we can. And one thing I worry about with the moral machine, for example, is setting up that dilemma around jaywalking is telling to me. You know, the concept of jaywalking historically was invented by the automobile industry to solve a problem. They invented and shamed people, mostly children and old people, who walked across what was then public space, open roads, to move them away because they were getting killed because the automobile, it wasn't normalized to get out of the way, and so people were dying. And so to accept that norm is a sign, in my mind, that we are just continuing on with what is maybe the automobile industry's view of the world and helping them fulfill that view. And my question is, in going through these analytics, it sets up a really strong picture of what the future is going to be. Even if it's hypothetical, even if it's speculative, it's compelling. And my worry is, how do we, not my worry, I guess my question to everybody is like, how do we surface alternatives to that? For example, what I would love to know is like, are autonomous vehicles going to make a city more livable? Not easier to get through or get around in or cheaper for rich people, but actually a better place to live. I'm based in England and the University of Cambridge. It's walkable, you know, because it was built before the automobile. But anyways, I won't labor that point. The last thing I wanted to say was just about universal basic income. I wondered if you guys had heard of any studies being done that asked people if that's what they want. Because that, again, it shows me it's kind of a poverty of imagination around what the future can be. And it's filling a place that could be much more rich in detail about how, you know, we could use these technologies to bring our values out, as opposed to kind of having this top-down, this is what we're going to do, and then we just have to test whether it works or not. Well, it's not whether it works.
Want to take the UBI?
Well, let me just put a pin in and agree that I think part of your group name is called Scalable Cooperation. And I think the thing that you're pointing out, which I think is one of the failures that ties to some of the new stuff, is we don't really know how to talk about these things. And we say, well, we should decide. Well, how do we do that? And how do we come up with imagination? How do we have a conversation? Do people actually want it? If we have a conversation, how do we make that decision? So it's beyond law. It's kind of democracy. And this is kind of where Larry's quadrants go to his fight on corruption, because we can think and wish everything we want, but if we can't execute it. So I think in addition to this, and this ties to framing and things like that, is like the question that you had, you know, do we want a walkable city rather than AVs? I mean, that's a really interesting question. How would we ask that in a place like Detroit? How would we even, who would surface? I mean, like you had Jane Jacobs, who just was an activist, and she was kind of, that's one way. You write a book. You could blog. I mean, but it's really hard to think about what, like, if you took your opinion, and how do you then challenge the system? I would put that as part of the meta question.
Yeah, I think that's build on that actually, and I think you raised a very good point about, you know, the status quo defines the kinds of question you ask, and then sort of it's a perpetual cycle. But I do see that there is a role for different types of people, different types of thinkers or citizens in shaping things, right? And I think a technology historian or a technology critic would say, you know, would do precisely that. They would critique certain things and say, well, why are we living in a world in the first place in which jaywalking is, you know, is considered something wrong, right? And I think that's an important conversation to have. It may or may not mobilize enough people. Maybe if you become an activist, then you could mobilize enough people to change things, because there are mechanisms for change, right? And they're not just the critique. Critique is part of it, right? Another part of it, I think, is knowing the facts. And I think this is where I see our role is as scientists. So we see ourselves as scientists who are trying to understand the psychological and social and economic incentives and biases that shape people's perception and how they handle a new technology. And this is what enabled us, I think, to identify things like moral hazards, where if you leave the autonomous cars to the market, they will prioritize their owners, and then you undermine, right? So that's a fact. You know, that's something you can go and you can try and replicate. It's an experiment that produces a consistent result, right? So, and the same thing goes with, you know, why do people overestimate their own driving skills? That's a psychological fact that could also be taken into account. So it's not complete, right? It doesn't answer all the questions, but it provides a piece of the puzzle, I think, that could help us build something that's based on critique of value, which is a subjective thing that we can discuss as a society, but also understanding the facts and the incentives at play and the cognitive biases at play and so on. And I think they just complement each other. So I don't think they're inconsistent.
I just wanted to process Johnny's intervention a little bit. I almost see it as a nice critique of an amendment to point 2 on your slide, because when you start looking at what's embedded in that assumption, it's a single axis. Should we slow technological progress? Are we Luddites, yes or no? No, we are not, but we do want prosperity. So we do want prosperity. We also want equality, so that leads to number 3. How about UBI? But Johnny's question is saying maybe there's all sorts of different forms of technological progress. Of course, what might be progress to one is not progress to another, not because they've lost their job, but because the city is now a hellscape of automated vehicles that you're dodging like Frogger while you're still jaywalking. And that's the kind of, sorry to use an old reference like Frogger. It also reminds me, I'm old enough to remember the Segway. And when Dean Kamen was first talking about codename Ginger, like, oh, it's going to change society. And people for a while, like Wired Magazine, how many issues did it eat up being like, Segway is going to change society? And then a bunch of people are like, actually, they're not allowed on the sidewalks. And you know what? They're not allowed on the road either. Okay, we're done. Like, if there had been a question about what we might want out of them collectively, which could be different from what would each of us individually use them for, the same kind of dilemma around what would we individually use Walmart or Amazon for, even as all of us decry the decline of the local hardware store. Yep. It's a neat governance question. And the Segway is also a really interesting, I think, exception to the typical configuration in America, at least, which is most things are legal until they aren't. Joey's fond of this distinction, too. The Segway was not legal until it was, given that it was vehicular and it sort of vehicular. But most
kinetic.
Things, yeah, right. But we don't ask for most technological progress. Like, what do we want? It's just like, well, what will people buy? And do we get upset enough together to ban it, which is almost never the case. And maybe autonomous vehicles...
Although it's starting to become, right? It's the New York City Council. I think it's now, this is why this class is so timely. I think it's people are starting to ask these questions, and these words are becoming vague. I think prosperity for who?
Yes.
Equality
I was going to say, in the case of autonomous vehicles like the Segway, they may benefit is from a perspective of wanting to kind of contemplate together what we want rather than letting a just sort of market process decide, by the fact that, like the Segway, they're vehicles, they're going to be on roads, and there's this network of both local and state and sometimes federal regulation where you could condition the acceptance of them in your town or nationally on a particular vision for what they have to do. So it really is an interesting opportunity and an invitation to think optimistically about it rather than just saying, here's all the awful things that can happen. Sorry, I know there's other hands up. Please, Vicky, please.
Yeah, so I think something that people always forget is the future is not inevitable, it is made. And so with this notion that slowing technological progress, and this is what it's going to be, so we have to figure out how it is, that in itself is self-defeating, especially because everyone in this room in some way will have a hand in what the future will end up turning out to be like. So just quick reminder that the future is to be made, and to kind of get out of this notion that it is going to be what it is, and kind of echoing your statement and Joey and Jay-Z as well, like progress for who? Slow technological progress. That's so, just the notion of progress is really loaded right there.
And I would just add, though, that things don't usually turn out the way you intended. So I don't think Mark Zuckerberg intended for this to happen. So the other part, I think, is that even with the best intent, it can get screwed up. So I think there's an intent, but then we have to think about how do we design the iterative process to get to where we want to go.
Which is also funny, because juxtapose it with the conceit, hypothetically, of the kind of moral machine style questions that kind of presuppose we could granularly decide what at the moment is just like in the flash of an instant of a crisis.
Although the Google patent points to the notion that they're trying.
I get that. Yeah.
But, I mean, I'm with you, and I think we shouldn't be defeatist about any of these things. But I do also think that we need to take the facts into account as we design our systems, right? So as we come up with our ideas. So there have been really great ideas in the past, like communism, that have really not work because I don't think they took human nature into account properly, right? And to anticipate how this thing might play out, given the incentives that you place in the system and how people can co-opt them, right? Co-opt the system to their own advantage. So I think knowing the facts, knowing human nature, which is something I'm fascinated by, and this is why I'm kind of even though I'm a computer scientist by training, I'm becoming more of a social or behavioral scientist, is because human nature determines a lot of these things. And I think you could try to change human nature, you could try to shape it, you could try to de-bias people, but it's it's sticky, right? Opinions can change as well, but humans want certain things, and they're driven by certain things, and there is such a thing as what it's like to be a human. And I think preserving your child in the car is one of them, right? And that could lead to certain outcomes. So I think it's good to dream as long as we're kind of grounded in the constraints or understanding of at least the facts, right? And this is where I think and maybe there are facts that we hate, right? Like about ourselves, and we should ignore, and we should find ways to suppress, discriminating against homeless people in a car crash, right? But it's useful to know that people think this way, right? It doesn't mean that you're endorsing it.
So maybe I'll start with a brief comment on the second question, slowing down technological progress. So I'd agree that the question, if it's phrased like that, is very broad, and it's probably difficult to answer if it's put like that. But I would add that from my point of view, there is a question in certain specific contexts about the pace of technological developments, and especially in the context of automation, for example, the ways in which tax systems incentivize or disincentivize, for example, the shift from human labor to automation. And so I think we need to be careful not to create dogmas as to the necessity of trade-offs, right? That's sort of the risk, I think, for people to think there's necessarily a trade-off between generating the welfare gains from automation and equality. So I'd be very hesitant to believe claims that there is a trade-off, but to the extent to which there really is a trade-off, I think it's worth considering, policy measures, including tax measures, that smooth the progress of automation.
On the UBI thing, at least what I found reading as much of the research that's been done is we don't understand what the trade-offs are because we don't know what the effects are. So I think part of it is also figuring out what questions to ask to try to get data to create models, but also figuring out the framing, right? So this is where the humanities and the social sciences can come in and say, well, what do you mean by that? And here are three ways to think about it, and let's look at what progress means. Going back to Norbert Wiener, I mean, he questioned whether progress was this thing that had to march forward, whether growth, there's a great series of books and essays around the limits of growth, that in a physical environment you can't grow infinitely. So this notion that growth and progress are by definition good. I mean, so I think there's some really interesting broader questions that we need to ask because we're sort of at a pivotal moment. And so, but I think we need to your point, start to ground truth the data because we don't even know what we're talking about right now in many of these layers.
I think also in relation, maybe it's repeating myself, but in a different context here. But I think also there are things we like the world to be, ways that we like the world to be, and ways that we like things to be in general. But there are also laws that are, like evolutionary dynamics. There's competition in the world between different ways of running things. You could say, for example, we want to live in a world in which there's no, we don't care about progress, and then other countries, this is like one example of an unintended consequence. Okay, let's scrape, let's not care about, material prosperity, and let's just care about other things, family values and whatnot, right? And then another superpower rises, and then they wipe you, right? Mm-hmm. Like that's something you have to think about when you're making those kinds of choices, because there are other processes in the world that are taking place. I think, in relation to kinetic autonomy as well, like, drone warfare is another example. Unless you can get global agreement to limit them, if you don't do them, they will, next war, you lose, right? So and then that way of life disappears. So unless you're cognizant of this and you're able to imagine it, as well as imagine how the world could be better, imagine how it could be worse. I think is a helpful thought exercise as well.
Good. Kathy, who's next? Effie.
Thank you. So you were talking about the human norms and how they affect our decisions, and you showed the moral machine of how people think about, male versus female, the young versus old. Do you think a similar experiments can be done for if people would prefer living in a society where there is universal basic income versus a society where there is less technological progress, or a society where this economy collapses and they don't have jobs but they have security?
So are you suggesting using a similar sort of platform to crowdsource other kinds of values?
Yeah, I mean, basically variables that we have not much idea about, maybe people would prefer not having jobs but having the leisure to, spend more time with family versus having to work really hard, so they wouldn't prefer UBI. Is it possible to sort of simulate or understand the very fundamental social norms around these concepts? Because I would imagine that as these things get closer, people may start rebelling against, okay, I actually want my job, and I want to be able to work, and I want a fulfilled life, or vice versa.
Yeah, I haven't thought about how...
Well, I think, again, the questions, you can't ask the right questions unless you know what the trade-offs are. There's this stupid old saying, I'd rather be rich than stupid. It's like prosperity versus equality. Is that the right question?
On your Davos panel?
Yeah, exactly. But I think the UBI is a great example because I think a lot of the trade-offs are really unknown. And the other thing that's interesting, this ties to somewhat to autonomous vehicles, is that when you start looking at the system, there are so many complicated theories about how the market will change. Will there be massive inflation? What amount is right? So I think there's going to be experimentation, but also there's this political element. So the Finnish example, was a really great experiment until the politicians took over and said, oh, you know what, we're not going to give any UBI to people with jobs, only with people without jobs, and we're going to limit it. So it turned into a project just to try to get people to get basically cheaper jobs, rather than answering the question, would people that have jobs quit their jobs and go to school if they had UBI? My biggest problem with UBI is that even though it has bipartisan support, it has bipartisan support because at the end you can fiddle the details kind of at the end of the thing and make it go veering in one way or the other. And I think that right now, as a public, it's very difficult because if you ask somebody a question, would you like free money? Most people probably would say yes. But then if you say, but there's a risk that it has this effect, and maybe the Republicans will use it as an excuse to get rid of welfare. Have you thought about that? Have you thought about this? So when you include the political process, it turns into this horribly sort of stochastic mess where you don't really know what the outcome is. And I think this is the other problem about looking at these things as engineering problems, when they're all often very kind of like ecosystems, where you can kind of make a prediction. You can predict that the snowstorm is going to come, and half the time it's correct and half the time it's wrong. And so the other part about this is when you live in a world where you have these very complex problems that we've never faced before, what is the governance model? How do you answer these questions? How do you ask these questions? How do you adapt? Right?
I agree.
Do we have Natalie?
Yes, a quick question, comment. So I'm thinking back to the map you showed of the moral machine project, where you're the parts that are lit in the world. So your responses are coming from more like urban areas, more Western, perhaps centric, developed areas in the world. And I'm also thinking about the people in our classroom. This is a really highly elite group of people here. And I'm just wondering, about how do we bring the process for bringing more people into this conversation? So a lot of people have mentioned, enabling, empowering people with agency to think about alternatives. But, the nature of the conversation we're having, they're also very highly technical, and people in this room have a lot of invested a lot of time learning to think about technology, create technology, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm just wondering, given the pace at which technologies are progressing and rolled out into the world, and the time needed for us to educate people, to empower people with the knowledge needed to think about these things critically, to think about alternatives, alternative futures that we might want. Who is responsible for doing that? And just thinking about the global scope of the conversations needed, how do we think about this educational component?
First, I do agree with you that there is a lot to work on in this as well. Of course, like we don't cover the whole world. But I still think that this is still better than what has been done before. I think we have reached more than what was reached before, and I think like an important part of this exercise is when people go over this. I think one part is like gamifying this, making it seem like a game, make the explain these questions in a easier way, like visualized way, making it seem as if it was like a fun exercise where so many people feel like they want to go over this on their own without being paid or without being pushed to do this. The other part is going over this exercise could play a role in making people like get more knowledge about this topic through first, like, the fact that you're playing this game, you appreciate how hard it is to resolve this kind of dilemma versus like also makes you like more engaged in knowing more or like getting into more conversations. I don't know yet how we can make this into the next step.
But in a way, it's kind of hard to present this work without ending up kind of almost being asked to solve the world's problems, like all at once. But I do think it's a new way of engaging the public. But we've always had these problems. These aren't new. Like not including everyone in a conversation.
And I think the key is that you've basically discovered a way to collect massive amounts of data from lots of people. And you have a model of how to integrate it. And I think part of what we should be thinking about collaboratively is how do we use groups like this that are interdisciplinary to help figure out what the question should be and use the tool that you've designed. I think that's the point, right? This is an example of how to use the tool.
Yeah, we actually did a follow-up project that Eddie here led as well, which is using the same idea to get people to donate money. So you can either donate money. It's called My Goodness. You can check it out as well. There's and initially it was real money. So you would donate money to somebody, like one person locally, versus the same money would buy food for 5 people in Africa, right? So would people favor efficiency or would favor some other thing? Like somebody who's more like me, and things like that. So we've not as successful in terms of like millions of people, but we've had a few 100,000, which is still good. But I think we're still learning from this experience as well. It's not easy. People have some limited attention nowadays, and how many things can they think about?
Hi. So I think that in construing the conversation about autonomous vehicles to be something that's has to be a trade-off between saving lives or like making sure that there isn't too much unemployment might not necessarily be imagining the full potential of what AVs could be. And you mentioned Detroit and Barbarasi and Cesar Hidalgo, and another name that comes to mind is Sandy Petlin's work from the Human Dynamics Lab. And in his book, Social Physics, he talks about this idea of idea flow, right? So cities are prosperous because a good amount of information is flowing through them, and cities are not diverse because there are information silos, et cetera, right? So, this is maybe a little bit of a wild idea, but couldn't the network of autonomous vehicles also be a strategic way of directing information flows such that we could, therefore, then increase economic prosperity, diversity of ideas, on and on?
Yeah, I think there are people working on this. There are people trying to estimate like the economic productivity increases due to autonomous vehicles, how much parking slots, how many parking slots you're going to free up, and what you can do with that real estate, especially in places like New York. So there's lots of people thinking about this. So it's much broader than what we're doing. We're focusing here specifically on human judgment and human psychology to some extent, and then also impact on labor. But yeah, these are all important things. You have one here?
I actually kind of want to hijack a little, just TA's prerogative. Something that we haven't talked about at all, and Sabrina's question kind of brought up, for me at least, is what happens in terms of all of these maybe new work, old work, but essentially we've been shifting them into these surveillance economies, and so that we can study them about who's going to be displaced, who's not going to be displaced, who will be surveilled, truck drivers being the first ones, of which they are both being displaced and surveilled at the exact same time. Do you feel like there are any ways to reconcile that?
It's a hard problem. You mean how? I mean, that's the thing. This is one of the things that makes me a little concerned, that there's a lot of value in surveillance, right? Surveillance improves, compliance with rules, and it does, it has things that would lead, groups to be more efficient, more, less cheating and things like this. It could actually even reduce corruption in some cases, right? Like imagine if, like the cams that police wear, if they were to get better. I mean, there are examples where this could be helpful. There are situations, in which it's detrimental. And the problem with surveillance, I mean, I'm not an expert on this, so in this case, I'm speculating. But I think there are short-term benefits with long-term kind of systemic risks, right? Because then all of a sudden, you have a state that can surveil everyone and nothing can change, right? So how do you trade off this sort of short-term, things are efficient, we have less crime, in London, there are cameras everywhere, everything's great, until you have a, 1984 sort of world, right?
And it blends right into the algorithmic bias conversations that we had, right? Because we're seeing credit scores being used to give or not give jobs. Obviously, if you were in a category in a city where you were likely to displace, I can imagine mortgages not being available, maybe even retraining. So I think the problem, there's the data and the surveillance and the collection, and then the next layer, I think, is the algorithmic bias. And the thing is, there is kind of the surveillance state as kind of intelligence agency, but there's also, as we've seen from Kathy O'Neill and Julie Engwin and all their work, even insurance companies that aren't intending to do harm, just by the way that the data is being aggregated, is starting to be biased. And so I think we're going to have to be diligent at each layer, including the collection of data. And I think that there's a lot of politics right now and pushing with the Facebook stuff in particular, that people should be able to control their own data, which I think is with the GDPR and others is a thing. But I think also it's really important because people are going to ask you, well, can I have your data? This gets back to the question that I had, would you want free money? And if somebody says, I'm going to give you money if you give me that data, but unless you know how that data is going to be used, and unless you understand algorithmic bias, you really have not enough information to answer that question. And so I think the question on surveillance and the question on controlling your own data, what does that mean, is I think they're actually quite similar.
But I think it kind of relates to the same point, that the immediate benefits are visible and the long-term costs are not, right? And it's
not necessarily. Surveillance of who? We only surveil poor people these days.
I would say there's, wealthy people also carry phones
primarily
and get,
surveil poor people.
Once in a while get in trouble too, right? I mean, I don't know.
Not systematically.
Yep.
By accident, because they get caught on a camera, not because they need to report for every welfare benefit that they get. Kathy, I think you were next, and then Matt.
This goes back a little bit to the moral machine. I've heard you mention a few times that this is just a fun game, and I'm interested in kind of the language and conversation around that, because ultimately there are actually real people writing the algorithms making these decisions, and we're actually seeing engineers at places like Uber today. When I talk to some of my colleagues or friends over at Uber, just kind of like, algorithms. This happens. When a self-driving car kills someone, well, it happens, it's expected, it's another statistic, and also a similar kind of like flippant attitude towards it. So I'm curious to see if like the language used around this, even though it's meant to be a game, it's actually also dealing with real decisions people make in their real jobs, which actually also leads to potentially killing people. And so I'm curious for the decision around making this like a very fun, quote, fun thing.
Okay, so I'm gonna respond with a question. Do you think there has been any movie that has actually caused good change, like actually educated people about an important topic? You know, whether it's, you know, movies are entertainment, right? People pay money to be entertained by going to a movie. And it could be a sad movie, but they still...
I mean, that's a silly question, but of course there are movies that have done that. So what are you getting at?
So the point is that, you know, the fact that it's a, you know, it's a game, or people go there because they kind of enjoy being asked these difficult questions and answering them doesn't, I think, diminish from the importance of the point being made. And sometimes, I think this is why art is so important, right, in the world. Art is a way of taking very difficult questions and putting them in a form that people would actually appreciate aesthetically and are able to engage with without having to be technical engineers and so on. So I think, you know, in that way, you know, that's the kind of sense of, you know, fun, you know, if you like using the word fun, it's used in that sense, in the sense of making something very complicated more palatable and more, you know, making it easier for people to engage with it, not kind of diminishing its importance or sort of somehow playing with people's lives or something like that. It's the contrary, actually. Sometimes I think it's the only way to people's minds is to make it, to frame it in a way that makes it a bit easier, right?
So we only have 2 minutes left. Lucky for you, this is the last question for your hot seat. Max.
So I'm curious, kind of to go back to this idea of scalability and crowdsourcing in general. And it ties into what Joey was talking about really knowing and understanding the trade-offs. And maybe the way I want to ask this question is just, do you think we've learned more in kind of debating the issues around AVs in just this very small number of people versus the 40 million sort of flash judgments of people out in the world? And I liked how you guys in the talk put up, you know, the 3 engineers, the 3 policymakers, the Catholic priest. They came down and sort of debated and came up with a bunch of principles. How do you think about, first of all, you know, what's the best way to generate these kinds of decisions? Is it the 12 smart people in a room or 40 million kind of crowdsourced opinions online? And if it's the former, what does that say about the scalability of cooperation?
Again, another difficult question. I think it's a normative question. So I don't think I'm not trained to kind of handle. I mean, I have opinions about normative questions, but I don't know how to resolve normative questions. I think this is, you know, what people like Jay-Z ask. How do you answer normative questions? But I do think that, you know, just anecdotally as well as from the data, I think now, thanks to the moral machine, we had this conversation. Thanks to the moral machine, you know, my colleagues, my co-authors, you know, overhear random conversations in bars, you know, by bikers, you know, who are like full of tattoos and like long beards talking about the moral machine, you know, about what does it mean for bikes and so on. And I think that's been useful. So I think that it has promoted discussion of, you know, algorithmic decision making in the world, which, you know, makes it much more palatable than a system in, you know, managing something very extremely complex. And I think also we've learned something from the data, right? So we've mapped something that could be used, you know, in a good way or in a bad way by those who are, you know, taking the data and then maybe using it for normative aims. So I think that's kind of a safer, you know, position to be in as a scientist as well.
Thank you, Iyad.
Thank you.
Thanks for being a good sport. We're sort of out of time, so we'll do a quick wrap up.
Yeah, it's just great. Thank you, Iyad, for being here again. And it's a great example of the selection of topics that we picked for the course are not only each of them at the moment dense thickets of problems, fractured and multiple methodologies of attacking them, and great societal uncertainty about even what counts as a good answer. That's why we picked them. And as we kind of hit the last lap of the course, our next week's meeting is our last one. It's a good reminder that really I think all we can do in a course that meets once a week for even fewer than 13 discrete sessions, because we had our big opening weekend, is be able to just give you an evocative set of problems and partial ways that some people have addressed them, and sometimes reaching inward here at the Media Lab or over at Berkman Klein for people doing really interesting work and in a position to share it with us directly, and I hope with you on the hot seat, both of you, to serve as a resource for anybody wanting to write a paper in either of these two sub-areas, whether it's the moral machine stuff or whether it's the labor stuff that we had. And that includes a paper or a project that might be intensely critical of the approaches that they've chosen, descriptively or normatively, or as our history of science friend Johnny will tell us, they're always both embedded with one another. That's great. I hope that exactly all the loose ends that by design we are leaving are ends for you to think about how you want to take it up and what you might want to write, either just as an exercise of citizenry as you think this through for the course, or as a seed of something that you might want to develop further in later studies or in whatever you choose to return to or go as a career. So that's,
And I have one meta point as we prepare for the next class. So I don't want to sound too self-important or too overambitious about this class. I mean, I think this class is a very peculiar class because it's a very complex, fast-moving topic. We have a bunch of people who are here who have completely different backgrounds and languages, and these are topics where it's all live action right now. And I think as we were, the syllabus is already outdated because everything is happening in real time. So it's hard right now, I think, and there's a little bit of squishiness that I think that people who typically go in very rigorous modes might feel a little bit uneasy. But what's happening right now, so Jay-Z and I and many of the people who are involved are talking to the automobile companies, the governments, the courts, the regulators, and we're not the only ones here, but we're one of the players who are being asked, how do we think about this? So a lot of the questions that we have right now aren't really academic questions. That are actually very practical, timely questions. And if we grab Iyad right now, we could wrangle him and change the way he thinks. And so I want people to think a little bit
rather
like
weird Clockwork Orange reference, right there.
But I think I want everybody to put their practitioner hats on a little bit and realize that you have an influence on where the conversation goes. These videos are going online. We have people watching them and tweeting about them and making interesting. There's actually a tweet. Well, we won't go to. But
it was deleted.
We are part of a group of people right now shaping a really important conversation. So I want to make sure as you think about your projects, think about what you're going to do, what we're going to do. And think about the responsibility that you have in setting the trajectory that, remember that conversation with Iyad? That actually changed the arc of this conversation to this horrible mess or this wonderful thing. And so I think it's really, I don't want you to feel self-important, but I want us to feel like we're in an important topic at an important time.
And another just real quick thing would be too, feel free to be optimistic. We tend to tilt towards what the issues might be, but actually being able to explicate a constructive vision for what can be done has its own real appeal to it, rather than just, this won't work, I don't want it.
It'd be good to come into the next class with a few opinions.
Yeah.
And I think we should bat them around.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
All right.
All right.
Thanks. See you.